Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.
Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me this week is Tyler Beuerlein. He's the Chief Strategic Business Development Officer at Safe Harbor Financial. Thank you very much for joining me today, Tyler.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email, the podcast, in the subject line. You could also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. Tyler, I always like to start with a little bit of background, especially when they have such a unique background such as yours. Tell me a little bit about your past and what brought you to cannabis.
Yeah, kind of a long story. I started in the sports world, so I was in the Mets organization for a long time. Started in real estate, private equity briefly, in off seasons during the downturn of the real estate market in Arizona in 2008. I started a sports drink company with Carmelo Anthony and the founders of Four Loko, and we had a really good run. But as we were transitioning out of that, a person that was potentially going to invest in that company had built a tech platform called Hyper that was used by banks to bank highly regulated cash-intensive industries. And so I transitioned from that to sitting in a bank in Colorado day one, the cannabis banking market. And then it's been a heck of a ride for the last 10, 11 years in this space. So I've been very fortunate to see all aspects of the industry over that time.
What did you play in baseball?
I was a catcher.
Oh, okay.
Ooh, how are the tools of ignorance. They're doing good. They're doing good.
Okay,
yeah,
very good.
I've been fortunate. I've been lucky, knock on wood.
Okay. And so what was life like at the sports drink company too? How did that idea come to fruition? And what was it like operating in that universe? And at the time, it was pretty fairly new still.
Yeah. So I guess the idea for that beverage came from when the coconut water craze hit. I tasted it for the first time and thought it tasted awful, and also felt like it was catered towards the wrong demographic, which should be the athlete, because we had grown up with Gatorade and Powerade and sugar laden drinks that were not necessarily good for us. And so I brought the concept to the founders of Four Loko. They had obviously gone through a very polarizing time, and I knew one of the founders was a good friend of mine, and they bought in. Carmelo Anthony bought into the company, and so I lived the CPG life for about 5.5 years. Brutal industry, but ironically, there are a lot of similarities in the CPG space, and obviously cannabis is headed that direction. I don't think it's there yet in the US, but a lot of similarities between dealing with distributors and retailers and distribution networks and all of the things that come along with those. Ironically, it was very similar to selling into banks. They were essentially our distributors for our product. We were dealing with another very difficult market. Rules were gray at best in a lot of cases. So it helped me. It gave me some really unique skills to be able to deal with this industry, and very thankful for that experience.
Do you consider yourself an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think at the core, and I think that's what's been great about cannabis is no matter where I've been in the space, it's still different every day. It's still a new challenge every day, even after 11 years, and so as an entrepreneur, someone that has an entrepreneurial mindset, that's very appealing.
How did you come to Safe Harbor?
So ironically, in a weird way, my company competed with Safe Harbor over the years. And so, but I always had a ton of respect for what Sunday had built. I knew Donnie Emmy very well, who's their general counsel, and always had a lot of respect for what they'd done. And so when they decided to go public on NASDAQ, there was a need. I think at the time for my skill set and background. And so it was just a natural fit. And it happened organically and the most unexpected way possible, but sometimes that's how the best things happen.
When did you come on board?
About 3 years ago.
Okay. What were the first few days at Safe Harbor like for you?
I think there's always a learning curve, and trying to get to know people, but great. I mean, it was, great to to meet everybody. Great to meet the new board that was going to be in place for as we went public. And just really nice to have everything in house for once. In my spot in the ecosystem, I was always referring people to banks and credit unions for lending for accounts. It's the majority of what I did for a long time, and so having all that stuff in house was really appealing.
A lot of times in these interviews, I find that people that have an athletic background, are more likely to be natural leaders. Would you say that describes you as well?
I would hope so. I think uh, I think as an athlete, one of the things that helps is you deal with tons of people constantly, and you learn a lot about human nature and how to navigate through situations. And you also learn how to uh, do what's best for your peers, right? And I always try and hopefully help the team always first, and maybe that translates into being a leader. I hate to ever put that title on, but I would hope so. You know,
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you're not going to find an industry with more striking personalities than the cannabis industry, I guess.
that is very true. That is very true. I
So
call it the Star Wars bar.
the Star Wars bar, that's a great comparison.
Yeah.
I mean, was it, I don't want to say startling, but was it an adjustment for you when you got into cannabis, just how things operated a little differently than other industries?
No doubt. I'll give you a quick, just anecdotal story. I was there for maybe the first ever exam of a bank banking it. And because we're a third party, we were able to take the regulators to lunch. They agreed to come to lunch with us. And one of my colleagues asked the lead examiner, he said, "Hey, uh, do you have an FFIEC handbook on how to examine a bank banking cannabis?" And the answer naturally was no. And he said, "Well, how do you examine an institution without any guidance?" And the guy held his hands up and he said, "We're just winging it." This is a federal regulator at the time. And so I think that summation is kind of a microcosm of everything that happened in every market. And I mean, one day I hope to write a book about all the stories because it's just been fascinating. I mean, every state's got its own dynamic. All the things that happen behind the scenes on the banking side, the regulator side, the operators fighting each other. I mean, it's been a wild ride.
So when you hear a statement like that, like we're just winging it, does that sound like opportunity to you, or does that sound like, okay, we got to be careful because no one really knows what they're doing here?
I think equal parts both. I remember too when we launched in Colorado, we started having success, and naturally the Pacific Northwest was kind of the next frontier from a cannabis banking perspective at the time. And I remember going to bank and credit union conferences, and they would have CEOs would pull me in back rooms and ask me questions because nobody wanted to talk about it publicly, and then they would have question rounds for the audience, and every banker would raise their hands and they'd ask 100 questions. Not one would be related to cannabis. And then they would have an anonymous question round, and every single question in the anonymous round would be related to cannabis banking. So huge opportunity, but again, a ton of risk, a ton of unknown, and candidly, the regulators were learning too. So it was, even by region, you'd have a different experience.
How would you describe the current state of cannabis banking?
Uh, this is the most competitive landscape, hands down, I've seen since my time in the space. And it's becoming commoditized. It's becoming, I would say, a vicious battle for depository relationships. And one of the reasons for that is the interest rate hikes over the last couple of years. It put institutions that had lent in a situation where they needed deposit growth fast. And so naturally, you know, um, when it comes to survival, sometimes risk profiles go out the window. And we saw some large institutions sprint at the industry thinking they would get quick, easy deposits from it. And I think in a lot of cases, cut corners to get there, but it's created this really highly competitive landscape. So I think the cannabis banking crisis has been over for at least a couple years. Crisis, I would say, and now it's a situation of, I think this year especially, we're going to see a large number of institutions with cannabis banking programs get out of the space because they just can't compete.
Really? I mean, how is it that they're unable to compete? Just because when I hear from some people working with the banking side, because there is more risk, things are just more expensive to do business. When it comes to cannabis banking, why are people running from it?
I think I think there's been a commoditization on the banking side a little bit. I think prices have dropped to the point where unless institutions are lending and they have other sources of revenue, the cost of a compliance program doesn't equate to the amount of revenue they can potentially get. And then the flip side of that is every operator that an institution wants to bank is now holding their deposits hostage, saying, "Hey, the only way we're moving is if you grant us credit, at a certain rate or on these properties." And so if an institution doesn't have a lending program, it's going to be tough sledding.
So, what do you see any major changes happening either in the next year or with this next administration?
I do. Ironically, I think I've been the most pessimistic person about things like safe. I mean, um, and I've gotten vilified for it over the years, but it's again, it's been accurate. Fortunately for me, I've had little faith in the federal government getting anything across the finish line. But ironically, I think that this administration will end up being the best thing that's happened from a legislative push standpoint to the industry. And I think that the reason being, it may have very little to do with cannabis. And I'll give you an example. I think we're on the eighth round of SAFE. Um, I it's been kind of a running joke at this point. But I think the reason that SAFE will pass fairly soon has more to do with the gun and ammo industry than it has to do with cannabis. And if you look at legislation called Operation Choke Point that was put into play during the Obama administration, many people on the conservative side view that as attack on the Second Amendment to the banking system. Now you're hearing rumblings of, was Operation Choke Point 2.0 in place over the last few years? And I think that I think preventing that from ever happening again is going to be coupled with cannabis banking, and it's going to be pushed through. I really believe that. The other thing that I think is going to happen is I think the rescheduling is imminent. And one of the main reasons for that, I think, is because right now, the jobs that have been generated by the cannabis industry cannot be reported on a job report, right? So when they come out with the jobs report every quarter or whatever it is, it has never been able to include cannabis jobs because it's federally illegal. If rescheduling occurs, all of a sudden you have, let's say, 500,000 jobs that can be added to the jobs report. That is a huge win for an administration, right? And
I
so
never
I
thought of
think,
that.
yeah, so those two things aren't being talked about in the industry, but I think are going to be the biggest catalysts to help our industry in the most ironic way possible.
So, I guess, were you one of few people that weren't as uh, disenfranchised or not disenfranchised, upset when everything seemed to get pushed back a little bit recently?
No, because I do believe that it's not if but when, and it's going to happen this year. I firmly believe that.
Okay. How are you vilified?
I think a lot of people look. There are things about this industry that look, when you have companies that are publicly traded that are hoping and pushing a narrative because it's buoying liquidity, it's boosting stock prices. I've been in a situation where in a lot of cases, I've had access to information that isn't common. And I've also seen the political landscape behind the scenes and kind of understand, the game that's being played. Not that those people don't, but I think when I have come out in the past and exercise caution or tried to push that to the industry to say, hey, look, everyone's telling you this is going to pass. Here are the reasons why I don't think it's going to happen. There are some CEOs of companies that probably weren't very happy about that because it may have negatively impacted what they were trying to do. And you know, I I have to be Switzerland, right? I've had to my entire career, and I take pride in giving an honest opinion to people that ask. And so I've definitely gotten some backlash over the years for different things, but they haven't been wrong, fortunately.
One thing that you've mentioned over the years are issues that you take with operators in the industry taking shortcuts. Do you see that as improving overall in the industry, or are people still regularly kind of taking shortcuts where they can?
No, I'll give an example. I saw a large point of sale company the other day advertising credit card processing. I mean, these people know better. Like we've been here for forever. The branded card networks aren't coming into the space until federal legality. I don't even think SAFE will bring them in. And so anybody doing that is having to commit either bank fraud on an application or try and mask it through a stored value. And we've seen that model create real harm for operators, like significant. It's happened in the past many times. And so again, my point is not to be um, confrontational. It's just sometimes somebody has to speak up, and I feel an obligation just because of where we've all come from to at least have a voice in it. And so I don't. I think in some cases operators are doing the right thing, and there's some really well run companies. But I think people get desperate for money or revenue, and they start taking shortcuts. And I understand it. Like I understand that some retailers feel like they have to compete and they have to do certain things. I get it, but I get concerned when parties that are well respected represent something that's just false. It's just an absolute lie.
Well, and I do think that, as you kind of said, it's easy to be short sighted at times when you're trying to generate revenue, but you have to look at how it could impact you in the overall picture.
Yeah, and you have to look at how it'll impact your clients. I mean, we've seen instances where, and I'll use ancillary providers as an example. They go to market with massive raises with these valuations that are through the roof, and those valuations are largely tied to transactional revenue. The problem with that is the transactional revenue is predicated on products that have no chance of survival. They're not legal, they're not compliant, and so sooner or later, when the music stops and there aren't enough chairs for everybody, and we've seen that happen a million times in this space, it's problematic for everybody. And in a lot of cases, and I take pride in this too. I've been the one that gets the panic phone calls and tries to help people navigate from that point forward, right? And I love being there for people, and I always will. But it uh, after the 10th time of doing that for people, you kind of go, hey guys, there needs to be some accountability here.
Right. I'm sure that you work with these operators a lot, trying to get ahead so that you don't get these panicked phone calls. I mean, I assume that's got to be frustrating every once in a while, or most times when you receive them.
Yeah, it is. And a lot of times it's not frustrating the first time, but it's like when it's the same operator and it's the fifth time, you're like, guys, like, I mean, come on, help me help you or help yourself, but but again, I understand it. People are doing what they have to do to survive right now. And it's a difficult market right now.
Mhm.
It just is. So.
Well, one thing that's making it a difficult market right now are unlicensed competitors. Um, have you been encouraged with what some states are doing and trying to purge some of those unlicensed competitors from the market? Or do you think that more needs to be done?
Oh, more needs to be done
Okay.
without question. I'll give you an example. I know somebody uh, she's Trenton, New Jersey, as an example. Social equity licensee opens a shop, should be highly successful. Come to find out, he has, I think, 21 illegal shops within a 5 mile radius of where he's operating, and everybody knows it, and they're doing nothing about it. And so, when you see situations like that, where the political um, let's say elites are backing a cause, let's say social equity, but then turning their back to what's happening after they open. um, Again, you kind of sit back and go, guys, what are we doing? Or at least don't use this as a pedestal for your campaign, and then turn your back once you get what you need, because these people are dying. And so I think there are situations like that. I think New York obviously had a huge purge, which I think is good, but a lot of those folks will shut down and they'll open the same location 2 weeks later, right? And so, So I think that is a real problem right now in the Northeast. But that's where I think it's most heightened. I think a lot of other places are doing a much better job, but it's definitely not perfect, and a lot more needs to be done.
So, Safe Harbor recently passed an incredible milestone. It was $25 billion in processed cannabis related funds. And I think it kind of coincided with the company's 10-year anniversary. You know, what did it take to reach such a mark? And where do you foresee the company going from here?
Yeah, I think for me, this is kind of an ode to Sunday, right? I mean, Sunday Seafried, who's our CEO, took a risk when nobody else would. And what people don't understand is, as a officer of an institution, right? Let's take Sunday at the beginning. Like, let's go back to 2014 when she started doing this. A regulator can come in and impose a civil money penalty on a financial institution officer that can't be covered by the insurance policy of that institution. So, so personally, by making a decision like that when nobody else would, you're talking about somebody putting their head on the chopping block and taking that risk to benefit an industry. And people just don't seem to grasp that. They don't seem to have respect for that at this point. But I think it's really she built an amazing team. She took risk when nobody else would. And I think it's really just a phenomenal um, you know, trophy, so to speak, for her and for the group that she's built over the years. And in a lot of cases, I think she probably had a huge role in teaching regulators how to examine other institutions banking the space. So, so I think it's really a special thing.
Is cannabis banking, is that part of the industry underappreciated by the rest of the industry?
No doubt. I think cannabis banking is widely looked at as a pain point, whether it be cost or compliance or any number of things. And I understand why. I mean, it can be difficult and onerous at sometimes, and people, people think, well, why isn't Chase coming to Vegas? Well, they never will. And I think one of the things that folks need to understand is cannabis is not the only industry that goes through this. There are other highly regulated industries that are perfectly legal that have been essentially shut out of the banking system and have the same problems. And unfortunately for cannabis, it's always going to have a cash intensive component. And I don't think that the landscape is going to change much, even upon federal legality. I mean, if you look at Canada right now, I think there are 3 to 5 institutions that will serve the market in Canada, and it's federally legal. They don't want the compliance burden, and so I yeah, I think that I think it's gotten better, no doubt, but it's still not perfect.
What are some of those other highly regulated industries that you're talking about?
Payday lenders, check cashers, cross-border remittance, gun and ammo. There are a whole myriad of industries, in some cases that are larger than cannabis, that have, you know, many of the same pain points, and they can't quite thread the needle, and the banks trying to bank them constantly have issues doing it. And so it's expensive, it's onerous, but it's part of, it's part of playing in that space.
Safe Harbor has been around for a long time now, and there are still quite a few misconceptions out there when it comes to cannabis banking. What are some of the things that you run into the industry where operators still kind of get it wrong when it comes to that side of the business?
I think I see it more in new markets,
Mhm.
where operators just think that they can walk into, they get mad because they walk into a Bank of America and can't open an account. And it's like, guys, it's not how this works, right? And I think the other thing too is they don't understand that, if they go through the underwriting process and they're asked for information above and beyond what they would normally have to provide, they get irritated or they, point the finger at the institution. And what I try and explain to people is when you get into the cannabis business, you're in the compliance business, whether you want to acknowledge that or not. And in 99% of the cases, if a bank or credit union is asking for you to do something or asking you for documentation, it's because their regulator requires them to have it. And if they don't, the whole program's in jeopardy. And so, I would just, again, reiterate to the industry, like, understand that, we're not here to be difficult. I would love to onboard an account with two pieces of documentation and ID. We can't do that, and so that's the reality of the situation. The only conversation that matters in this equation is the conversation between the regulatory body and the institution. Everything that happens from there is it's basically dictated by that conversation.
Are there still big issues when it comes to the compliance side? And what are some things that people could do to kind of make it a little bit easier on themselves?
I think just ultimate transparency. I think look, if you're an operator and you decide you're going to raise money, and you're going to have investors that are wiring in money from another country, you know, uh, be transparent with your institution way ahead of time. I mean, let us get ahead of things. And then I think also, it's always a good sign when an operator asks us first, like, hey, what logistics provider should we use? What's going to make your life easy? Is there anything operational you'd like us to do that can help you from a compliance side? So I think the more that conversation can happen up front, the better off for everybody.
Okay. Um, you know, in your time in the industry, have you noticed any common gaps? Any low hanging fruit, or any ways that operators could improve their financial situations that are, for lack of a better term, easy pickings?
Uh, it's entirely dependent on the situation, right? It's entirely dependent on the market. I would say that one of the lowest hanging fruit is, don't get into a market that has little to no chance of survival just based on the structure. I mean, Oklahoma. I hate to pick on a state, but when you have an unlimited license market and somebody can open a competing dispensary in the door next to you for, whatever it is, $2,500, you know, uh, the chance of survival in a market like that, especially with 280E being a part of the industry, uh, good luck, right? I think that's one. I think also, um, I think I've seen on the retail side, a lot of operators make the mistake of really going nuts overbuilding a retail location and spending so much money and taking on so much debt that it becomes very difficult for them to make it in the end. I also think that, um, cultivation, especially in new markets, eventually it's going to become commoditized. And so I think operators need to really understand that, their model has to work in a price compressed model. And if it doesn't, that's going to be tough sledding, because it may not happen out of the gate, but within a 2 to 3 year period in almost every market, it happens.
How often do you run into that? Where, I mean, I guess I'm not sure how often you're client facing, but how often are you, you have someone from the industry on the other side of the table, and you're just like, hey, all of a sudden there are a couple of glaring things, and you're just like, you got to make some hard choices.
Yeah, and that's where I think we try and at least, we there's a line, right? We can't necessarily cross, but you know, I uh, I think the industry knows at this point. And I don't want to speak on behalf of other members of our team, but if an operator has a question, or needs advice, they can call us. And if it's not something that violates any kind of rules or restrictions we have, I mean, we're always trying to help. And I mean that sincerely, for with anything. I mean, I get calls, 10 o'clock at night on Saturdays sometimes, and I'll spend an hour on the phone with an operator just talking about different scenarios or things they might want to consider.
So my coworker was looking into it, and he saw that in your baseball career, you tend to walk a lot. So would you say that you're a patient man, and has that patience helped you have a more successful career in finance?
I'm not patient. Yeah, yeah. I think the thing that's helped me have success just in life is just, um, and this is kind of an odd thing, and I don't know that a lot of people would agree with it, but I've tried to really truly just be there for people and help them regardless of whether or not it helps me or the company. And in most cases, those things have come back tenfold. They really have. And not that that's expected. But I think that's been something that's been really helpful. And I think also an undervalued thing is just being able to find common ground with anybody. Because in this space, um, there are a lot of personalities uh, all over the map, right? And if you can't relate to people, if you can't find common ground with them, they're never going to open up to you. And in this space more than ever, information and relationships are key. They just are, and you're never going to get access to those things unless people know they can trust you.
Man, I hope that's not a controversial take. I hope people.
Yeah,
agree
I
with
mean,
you on that.
maybe it's not, but there's some hard nosed folks out there. So,
Yeah, no, I understand. Do you play anymore?
I play softball.
Yeah.
So it's not definitely not, but I enjoy it, and been fortunate to play in some cool places doing that. But no, it's I'm way past my prime now. I'm diving into the kids and trying to help them play sports, and then also I've been trying to help out at some schools here, just where I can with guys that are coming up. So
No, that's incredible. And I mean, it's a really cool story. Thank you very much for taking the time today. Before we get out of here, is there anything else that you want to make sure that, the Cannabis Equipment News audience either knows about yourself or your work at Safe Harbor?
I would say again, if anyone has a question, or I don't hesitate to call or reach out. I mean, I'm easy to find at this point. And then also, from a safe harbor standpoint, we're battling like everybody else, and we're trying to win business. And there's some things that we can do that are very unique for the industry, that are extremely beneficial. And so I would tell folks, even if you think you're happy where you're at or you've got an ideal situation, it's always worth the conversation because I mean, we've saved folks a mountain of money, been able to streamline their processes, been able to give them lending products that they maybe didn't have somewhere else. And so I would, just hope that people would at least take the time to explore.
I mean, I understand if you can't give away specifics or give away the secret sauce necessarily, but what are some of those unique things that you can do?
Well, we serve all state legal markets. And so for operators that, some of these folks still have 20 plus different banking relationships in different markets, we can streamline everything into one platform. We can get extremely aggressive on pricing, save them in some cases, six figures a year in bank fees. And then, the majority of institutions still won't lend, and we will. So, and then we have interest-bearing products for deposits, which are huge. It's another revenue stream that's not there for a lot of folks, and a lot of really creative stuff. And we're always trying to innovate and bring new products in that will help people.
So what's the roadblock there for people? Is it they just don't know that opportunity exists? Because when you hear something like going from 20 to 1 and the cost savings, I mean, that seems like a pretty simple calculation.
It does. But this is the cannabis space. And I find a lot of times, and God love them. I talk to folks and they'll say, yeah, we want to do this. But then, they're so used to doing things their way, and they maybe don't want, the extra work to move things over. There are a lot of factors that come into play there. But to your point, yeah, I mean, it's a no brainer. And we just hope that more people will take advantage of it.
Well, Tyler, thank you again for taking the time. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Right, before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com with email the podcast in the subject line. You can also subscribe to our daily newsletter. Make sure you get it delivered to your inbox first. All right, for Tyler Beuerlein, the Chief Strategic Business Development Officer with Safe Harbor Financial, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and we will see you next week.
Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.